This short lecture is Debating Black Art, the Harlem Renaissance. During this lecture, you'll learn a little bit about the historical context and some of the most important voices debating about the importance and use of Black art during the 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance. Be sure that you have something to take notes with, whether it's a pen and paper or some sort of an app. Also, make sure that you pause the video if you need a break or if you need to catch up with it. So let's get started. So in this video, we're going to talk about the historical context of the Harlem Renaissance. We're going to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and his idea of double consciousness, because that's going to be a really important theme and trope throughout the readings we do in this unit. We'll talk specifically about the Harlem Renaissance and voices talking about Black art during the Harlem Renaissance. So just as a review, let's talk a little bit about the historical context of this movement. As we saw in the other videos and as we've seen in the historical context from 1914 to 1945, the years after the Civil War had some massive changes for Black people in the United States. In the post-slavery South, so this is the period after the Civil War ends in 1865, there are a series of amendments that begin to give newly freed people more rights. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, but then the Black Codes Institute sets of rules to kind of limit what African Americans can do in the South. The 14th Amendment ensures citizenship, and the 15th Amendment ensures the right to vote for Black men. However, in 1896, we have the Supreme Court decision Plessy versus Ferguson. And this is the decision that's going to have major consequences for Black life in America, because this is the decision that said that segregation was okay. The separate but equal decision gave municipalities and other jurisdictions the ability to create segregated spaces for African Americans. In order to really understand the historical context of the Harlem Renaissance, we need to kind of back up to the turn of the 20th century and look at two really important Black voices, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So at the turn of the 20th century, there are many discussions happening about how to ensure that the newly freed people or Black communities in the South and in the North get to have assurances of equality and racial uplift. The first voice that we get historically is Booker T. Washington, who writes his landmark book, Up From Slavery, in 1900. Booker T. Washington is one of the preeminent African American spokespeople of this time. He's a leader in the Black community, and he is well respected by both Black Americans and white Americans, including like the President of the United States. He's what's considered an assimilationist. So in Up From Slavery, Booker T. Washington tells his community to cast down your buckets where you are. And so what this means is he is advocating for people in the Black community to not worry about getting ahead, but to really look at where they are now, to work hard where they are now, and little by little, they would make a process of racial uplift over time. He really emphasized agricultural arts. He was the founder of the Tuskegee Institute, which was a historically Black college that taught agriculture. And so much of what he discusses in Up From Slavery and in his writing and his speech is not so much about integration, not so much about immediate equality, but about the Black community working over time to earn equality. A few years later, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was another Black intellectual at the time, comes out with his book, Souls of Black Folk. And he really takes a very, very different approach to the idea of racial uplift. Unlike Booker T. Washington, who was a bit older at this time, who was born into slavery, W.E.B. Du Bois has a different take on it. He believes in something called the talented tenth. He says education must not simply teach work, it must teach life. So the Tuskegee Institute was really teaching agriculture. It was teaching kind of labor and working class positions. W.E.B. Du Bois is an intellectual. He is trained in Germany. And so he believes that the Black community can have the opportunity for education. He says the talented tenth of the Negro race must be made leaders of thought and missionaries of culture among their people. The Negro race, like all other races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. So for W.E.B. Du Bois, he was not happy with this assimilationist policy where you just kind of bide your time and work hard, and eventually the world will recognize you. He believed that there was a talented 10% of Negroes that were capable of going to college, of doing deep intellectual work, and that they would be the leaders of the larger community that would pull the entire race up. Now, these two men become competing um, theories of racial uplift, and various people would kind of line up behind each one of them, whether you were assimilationist or whether you were more of W.E.B. Du Bois's version of the kind of talented 10th that believed that we don't have to wait for racial uplift, that right now there are people within the Black community that are capable of being equal to whites. W.E.B. Du Bois is also really famous for his idea of double consciousness. And double consciousness is really going to underlie a lot of the artistic production and also the scholarly analysis of African American literature throughout the 20th century. And so he writes about this in Souls of Black Folk in 1903. He says, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." So if we pause here and look at this quote, I want to point out a couple features that are going to be really important to your reading of the poetry and the other work from Black writers throughout the 20th century. The first is the split between the idea of being a Negro or an African American and being an American, as though these are two separate categories. What we're going to see in our readings about debating Black art is that this is not necessarily agreed upon by everyone during the Harlem Renaissance or even beyond. W.E.B. Du Bois sees being an African American, being a Negro, being a Black American as something that creates this split in consciousness where you are both a Negro and an American, but those two halves never quite come together. The other thing that I really want you to pay attention to here in this quote is that this particular issue for Black Americans is not necessarily a bad thing. They are warring ideals, as he says, but it is the dogged strength that keeps the body from being torn asunder. So, one of the things that Du Bois is really recognizing is the internal strength of the Black community and the individual Black person to persevere despite kind of being torn apart or torn asunder by these two kind of warring ideals. He'll go on to write that double consciousness really gives African Americans, especially artists, this ability to see the world in a way that white Americans can't. It isn't a failing. And in some ways, it creates a strength that white writers are not going to have. So other parts of the historical context that you really need to pay attention to is the Great Migration. We talked about this before in the video that I posted about historical context 1914 to 1945. So the Great Migration is happening between 1910 and 1940. Another one will happen later in the century in the 70s, but millions and millions and millions of people leave the Deep South and they move north. In New York City, the Black population increases by 66%, in Chicago by 148%, in Philadelphia by 500%, and in Detroit by 610%. So you have completely new populations of people living in these northern cities. Black people also moved west to Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego. For the purposes of this class, we're really going to be looking at Harlem and New York City, though. So in 1920, you get what is known as the Harlem Renaissance, and this is really spurred on in part by that Great Migration. The other thing that helps this is Booker T. Washington passes away at this time, and so one of the voices in that argument between assimilationism and Black racial uplift drops away. And so you get theoretically and in terms of analyzing how to kind of deal with racial uplift and equality, more people are leaning much more toward the W.E.B. Du Bois version at this point in time because there's less of a tension there. So during the Harlem Renaissance, you have in a very, very small 3 square miles area a very large population of African Americans. And because of that, you get a sense of artistic creation, the likes of which has really never been seen before or after. Um, it is not just writers, it's musicians, it's singers, It's also visual artists. Part of this situation that we want to pay attention to, though, is that this is not just something happening in the Black community. This is widely known throughout New York City and throughout the area. So you get famous places, for instance, like the Cotton Club, which was a nightclub at the time that would have famous Black musicians, famous Black singers, and other acts come in. But the Cotton Club was a segregated club. The Cotton Club was meant for white patrons. So white patrons from New York City and the areas around New York City would come, they would go to Harlem in order to watch Black art. But the people in Harlem were not necessarily allowed in many of these clubs. So when we read poems later, like the Harlem Dancer, we want to kind of keep in mind that not all of the spaces, even in Harlem, were open and available to Black people. During this time, jazz and the blues is absolutely essential. In these pictures here, you see Louis Armstrong in the middle of the one on the left and his Hot Five, and then you also see Duke Ellington. Our crash course videos talk a little bit about the blues and jazz. As we read more in the poetry, we're going to see how these art forms really impact individual authors and how they influence African American literary production. One of the really important voices of the Harlem Renaissance is Alain Locke, who wrote The New Negro, a collection, an anthology of fiction and poetry and essays. This was really considered the first national book of African America. And in it, he puts forward this definition of the new Negro. So if you remember earlier videos, especially during realism, where we talked about the new woman as this feminist girl who could go out and get an education, could move through the world with a sense of ease and affluence. The new Negro is kind of the same kind of movement. This is a movement of the younger generation. So again, Booker T. Washington has passed away. His voice is kind of falling away, and the idea of assimilationism is no longer as popular. He says the younger generation is vibrant with a new psychology. The new spirit is awake in the masses, and each generation will have its creed. So the new Negro movement is as much a movement of the youth as it is African Americans. In that way, it's really very much aligned with the movement of modernism. If you remember from earlier lectures, I talked about the fact that most modernist writers were born right at the turn of the 20th century, and they grew up with the century. Most modernist writers were young, they were hungry, and they were ready to create something new. Many of the writers from the Harlem Renaissance are falling into the same category. So while we section off the Harlem Renaissance for special study, it's important to remember it really is part of this larger modernist movement in American literature. So the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of times in K through 12 schools, is taught as kind of this unifying movement in New York City, where everyone's on the same page, and mostly what you get is Langston Hughes's poetry because it tends to be the easiest to read, the most accessible, and to some sense, the most fun. But what's important to note is even during this time, even when Alain Locke's The New Negro is making waves not only in the Black community but across American art and letters, there is not one single idea of what Black art should do. So for this section, we're reading three short excerpts from some important writers and theorists at the time. We're going to read Langston Hughes, The Negro and the Racial Mountain, George S. Schuyler's Negro Art Hokum, and a selection from W.E.B. Du Bois's Criteria of Negro Art. So really briefly, I'm going to go over these for you. It's important that you're reading the pieces themselves because what you want to be able to do is look at the poetry that I've selected for you and see where the poets might be addressing these specific theories or ideas. So George Schuyler wrote Negro Art Hokum as a kind of reaction against this idea of Black art being separate. And as you read through his piece, what I want you to kind of pay attention to is thinking about why he might be making the arguments he's making. It's really important to connect this back to something like Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, which we read earlier. In Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson makes the argument that the enslaved people, that Black people, dark-skinned people, are not able to make art. And so much of what we've seen throughout the 19th and the 20th century is this idea that by creating writing, by creating art, African Americans are stating and performing their humanity in a way that makes it impossible to ignore. But the flip side of that, however, is that you can start essentializing Black art as something that is easily done and doesn't require craft and sophistication. So when Jefferson talks about, they have the slaves have music and that's kind of natural to them, that can really undermine the artistry, the craft, and the difficulty it takes to master music. So there are these kind of warring ideas in Schuyler's piece. He says, aside from his color, your American Negro is just plain American. Negroes and whites from the same localities in this country talk, think, and act about the same. And he says, African Americans are subject to the same economic and social forces that mold the actions and thoughts of white Americans. So, how then can the Black American be expected to produce art and literature dissimilar to that of white America? He's really questioning this idea of sectioning off Black art as something apart from American art. He's going to see Black art more as regionalism than as a separate art form. So he's thinking of Black art more in the terms of regional culture or what you would experience because you grew up with that particular culture. On the other hand, W.E.B. Du Bois is going to take a slightly different approach. And remember, Du Bois from the very beginning believes in this talented tenth of the Black community. He believes that 10% of the community at the time of the turn of the 20th century is capable of having equality and parity with white America. One of the things that Du Bois's piece is going to really underline is the importance of art in general. Um, he says, all art is propaganda and ever must be, despite the wailing of purists. And he says, whatever art I have for writing has always been used for propaganda for gaining the right of Black folk to love and enjoy. So, one of the things that Du Bois is really putting forward in his piece about the criteria of Negro art is that art itself becomes a way of creating social justice and social equality for Black Americans, and that it's not something separate from these larger conversations. That's going to be very, very different than Schuyler, who wants to kind of see art as just regionalism. Finally, we're going to read about Langston Hughes and the Racial Mountain. And in general, this is the viewpoint of the Harlem Renaissance that often gets taught in more simplified discussions of the Harlem Renaissance. Hughes's version of the Negro artist is the one that tends to win, right? And when we're not really kind of teasing out the complexities of the issue. So for Langston Hughes, he is very interested in looking at both the good and the bad of life in America for African Americans. There's a real concern at this time, as our crash course videos talked about, in what it means to represent, some of the negative aspects of African American life if white readers are going to be reading it. There are certain voices at this time that really want African American artists to only display the best of what their race or their culture has to offer. And Langston Hughes is not really down with that. He says that there is beauty in all of it. He says the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro artist in America, the urge within the race toward whiteness, the desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization, and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible. So as you're reading, that should be really clearly against Schuyler's idea that we're all just Americans and there's just a simple American literature. And Langston Hughes really has this kind of agenda of showing how Negro art, how Black art, through music, through writing, and even through visual arts, can be incorporated as a way of increasing the beauty of art. So, just to kind of review, as we move into the Harlem Renaissance, it's important to remember that this is a reaction to other big changes in the 20th century, including changes in the rights for African Americans and the demographic shifts across the country, and also in theories about racial uplift. And so that's why it's really important to make sure you watch that second crash course video, because it talks about the kind of more political undertones of a lot of this art. Remember that the Harlem Renaissance was in large part a result of the Great Migration. It made it possible to put large populations of Black writers and artists in one place. And it included artists, writers, and performers of all kinds, oftentimes producing art not just for the Black community, but for white patrons and viewers. It's also really important to remember that the question of Black art wasn't simple or even agreed upon, even within the community. There was this conversation about what defines Black art. Is it something having to do with biological issues of race and ethnicity? Is it the culture that you grew up in? Is there something specifically African that is passed down through the generations? Or is it the experience that you have in the places in which you were lived and raised? As you read through our readings for this unit, keep these ideas in mind so that you can start beginning to think about